I'm going to read in your hearing. Reading from verse 1 of Acts chapter 2, it says, "When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, 'Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, in our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power.' All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, 'What does this mean?' But others sneered and said, 'They are filled with new wine.'" So one of the last things that Jesus is recorded as telling his followers before his ascension was, "Don't leave Jerusalem until you have received the promise of the Father. John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." So now, after his ascension, Jesus' followers, they find themselves in a really unique situation where they are waiting for something, but they don't really know what they are waiting for. Because Jesus didn't describe what the baptism of the Holy Spirit looks like. So how will we know it has happened? Has it happened already? Did we miss it? Will it only happen when we're all together? I knew there was something that we should have asked him before he left. And so I bet that for at least the first couple of days, the disciples, they're here gathered together, I bet that they were on absolute high alert for this enigmatic arrival that could happen at any time and could literally take any guise. Maybe James whispered to his brother John, like, "I really need to go to the loo, but what if I miss it?" And maybe Simon would have said to Bartholomew, like, "When I popped down to the market earlier, this might sound a bit strange, but I swear I saw this dove and it came and landed on a tree and it was like he was staring straight at me. Do you think that was it?" Because they don't know what to look out for. They don't know what to expect. I'm sure that they have more questions than they have answers. And so maybe over dinner each evening, they would try and revisit the things that they had heard to try and work out hints and clues about what to expect. And maybe somebody remembered that years earlier, before they'd even actually met Jesus, when they were gathering at the River Jordan, where John the Baptist was drawing crowds and he'd been baptizing people, and John the Baptist had said, "I baptize you with water, but one is coming after me who will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire." So we know now to expect fire, and fire, according to the scriptures, fire has always represented God's unquenchable, unstoppable, cleansing power. And so the disciples, the followers, they stayed in Jerusalem and they waited. A couple of days turned into a week turned into a couple of weeks turned into a month. Time, as it is wont to do, it just kept going by. And it's not that they would have been bored, they were no doubt occupied. I mean, first of all, they went through the process of selecting a disciple to join the 12. They were living out their value of inclusivity. Then they were spending a ton of time in prayer. Plus they were now like pouring through the scriptures, and they're reappraising everything through the lens of Jesus as the Son of God, as the one who was prophesied from the very beginning. And after a month had passed, well, they now had to start making plans for one of the biggest festivals of the year, the day of Pentecost. And where better to celebrate a festival than in the capital city? That would be like being in Lapland for Christmas or being in Times Square for New Year's Eve. They were in Jerusalem, the cultural and economic capital, the religious and the political capital, and the festival of Pentecost was just around the corner. Now, in the Old Testament, this festival was referred to as the Festival of Weeks, or sometimes also as the First Fruits. This was a festival linked to the harvest, and it would be held exactly 50 days after the first day of Passover, another huge festival. So incidentally, these guys had a lot of festivals. I think this is something that we actually need to take note of. And so this particular festival had become known as the Festival of Pentecost. And Pentecost literally means 50th in Greek, 50th. And Greek was the lingua franca of the day. And so the day of Pentecost arrived, and everybody was gathered together in a house when something happens. And I would bet that if you were to have given the disciples 100 guesses for how they pictured the scene when the Holy Spirit arrived, that no one would have predicted what happened next. So Luke, our author, he tells us that there was the sound like the rush of a mighty wind that filled the entire house. And this sound was actually so loud that people all across the city heard it. And then Luke paints a picture of what happened next. He said that divided tongues of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. Now, it's hard to picture what this would have looked like. I mean, often when supernatural things take place in the Bible, there is a point of reference to something familiar or to something that has happened previously, and these help us to kind of contextualize what's taking place. But as these tongues of fire come and they rest on each of the disciples, this is a totally new scene. This is like nothing that we have heard of before. I like how one commentator speaks about the event. He says that the description that Luke gives us is so picturesque and so striking that it can only have come from an eyewitness. And so following this extraordinary event, the disciples, they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit then gives them the ability to speak in languages that weren't native to them. And so this event has caused such a scene, such a commotion. The noise was so loud that a crowd has gathered outside of the house. They've rushed down to see what this commotion was. And because this was taking place on the day of a festival, there were like lots and lots of people in town from many surrounding countries. We're talking people from really quite far afield. There are people from Mesopotamia. This is the region covering much of modern day Iraq and Kuwait and Syria. And then there were people from Cappadocia and Pontus. This is the region that covers much of modern day Turkey. And then there were people from Egypt and Libya. So we're talking Africans and black Africans. There were people from Crete and from Rome. Now we're talking Europeans. And there were Arabs, people from Arabia. And crucially, they were all Jews. People from Africa, from Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, but all Jewish. Contrary to what you might have heard before, we're talking about a rainbow coalition of diversity within this faith community. People from every part of what was the known world. They have all heard the sound of this mighty wind. And so the disciples rush out of the house to meet the crowd who are gathered outside. And those inside the house are as uniform as those outside the house are diverse. Because the disciples are all from Galilee, the northernmost region of Israel. Galilee, this place that's known for its distinctive accent. So the same way that you can easily pick a Geordie from up north out of a crowd, you could easily pick a Galilean from up north out of a crowd. And so the group who are outside of the house, they speak as many different languages as there are countries that are represented. And they are absolutely flabbergasted to hear their languages being spoken by people with no formal education, with no connection to their territories, and with no reason to have visited their lands. Peter, an uneducated fisherman, is speaking flawless Arabic. Matthew, the tax collector who works for the local authorities, is speaking Persian. Simon the Zealot, a previous Jewish fundamentalist who was previously at war with Rome, is speaking Latin. These Jews from Africa and Europe and the Near and Middle East, they are baffled and they turn to each other and they ask, they're talking about God's acts of power in our own languages. What does this mean? Now, we don't have a record of what the disciples said in response to this question, but with time to reflect on this miraculous introduction of the Holy Spirit, I think that perhaps they would have said, brothers and sisters, this means that the gospel is being made relevant. Now, we don't know for certain what language the people native to Judea and Jerusalem would have most commonly spoken. There's quite a lot of discourse about it. What we do know is that they would have been fluent in Aramaic. This is a Semitic language, quite similar in form and in structure to Hebrew. And it's also highly likely that most people would have had varying degrees of understanding of Greek, because the Greeks had conquered these territories a few centuries earlier, and their language was one of the memorials of their conquest. And so the way that English is most of the world's second language today, Greek was the English of its day. And so it's likely that the temple ceremonies would have been conducted in Greek and Aramaic, that Sabbath worship in the synagogues would have been led in Greek and Aramaic, that reading from the scriptures and the singing of hymns of praise, it would have been done in Greek and Aramaic. In fact, in Luke's first volume, in the Gospel of Luke, he describes Jesus in the synagogue on Sabbath, unrolling the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and reading in Greek. These were the practices of the people of God who lived in the country of God and worshipped in the city of God. And it would have been really easy for them to think that they represented the benchmark for how things should be done. It's like when you're doing word processing on your computer and you're typing words like modernize or synthesize or antagonize, and your computer keeps auto-correcting the S in eyes to a Z, because that's how the Americans do it. And if you're anything like me, you get really frustrated with your computer. That's not how it's spelled. I'm trying to write English in England. How we do it here is the way it's supposed to be done. You need to get with the program, Microsoft Word. It's really easy to think that that's the way it should be done because that's how we do it here. And so, as the Church of God was beginning to take shape in the city of God, it would have been really easy for the disciples to assume that their job was to roll out like a Jerusalem packaged version of the gospel. Everyone has to engage with this gospel in Greek or Aramaic because that's how we do it here. And if you don't speak Greek or Aramaic, you're going to need to learn Greek or Aramaic, because the message doesn't change for you, you change for the message. But as the Holy Spirit turns up for the first time, he makes it abundantly clear. This gospel message must be relevant. One gospel in different packagings. So I don't make the Syrian and the Roman and the Libyan have to conform to the way of the Galilean. Instead, I equip the Galilean to be relevant to the Syrian, the Roman, and the Libyan, because my church has to be relevant. It has to speak to people in ways that they understand. It has to speak to people in a manner that makes them want to listen. Packaging the gospel in ways that are palatable and interesting and accessible to people from different places in life and different spaces in life isn't just useful, it's divinely prescribed. It isn't optional, it's mandatory. This is literally the first thing that the Holy Spirit does when he bursts onto the scene. It's like he's saying, look, disciples, you need to pitch this in a relevant way for people who aren't from where you're from and don't know what you know. It's really easy to fall into a trap of thinking that the way the people of God do things is the way things must be done. And people just have to get with the program. The way that we have our worship, the style and the form and the sequencing, the start time and the duration, the version of the Bible that we use, the esoteric topics and themes that we like to talk about, this is how it's done. And we would love people to join this community of believers, but they're going to have to get with the program. We do Greek and Aramaic. That's just the way the people of God do it. But the Holy Spirit shows the church, while it's in its most embryonic stage, you need to be relevant. This means you have to grow and develop and change for the benefit of others, not the other way around. That means it's you who needs to be willing to learn new skills and challenge yourself and adapt, not them. When is the last time that any one of us started trying to learn something new for the benefit of somebody else receiving the gospel in a way that's relevant to them? Earlier this year, we started our Acts community choir. And unfortunately, we were just one session in, but we had to put it temporarily on ice because the COVID lockdown came into force. But the idea, the strategy was that some of us would be in the choir, and we would also invite people outside of our church community that we knew, so people like our family, our friends and our colleagues, and we would also promote it in the local area. And by the grace of God, thank God, we were actually on track with this strategy. In our first session, there were some of us from our Acts Church family who were there, and there were also some friends and colleagues who were there, and there were also some people new to our group from the local area who had seen the promotion who was there. And so my plan was that I was going to do all the background work. I was going to do the planning and the organisation and the administration, and then I would be present and I would take pictures and record video footage, and I would sort out refreshments and I would greet people and I would pack everything down at the end. That's what I was going to do, but I wasn't going to sing because that's not for me. But when the session started, literally 10-15 minutes into the session, I realised that for me to have a bigger impact, begrudgingly, I think that I might have to sing. It's not really what I was looking to do, but I think I'm going to have to challenge myself and try and learn some new skills in order to put me in a better position to be able to share the gospel. I'm the one who is going to have to adapt and grow and learn in order to be relevant. There are so many people who look at Christianity and think to themselves that, on balance, I'm sure it's a good thing, objectively speaking, but it's not relevant to me. People who walk past churches every day and they look up and they think, What a pretty church. I can imagine getting married there. But that's about the only thing that's relevant to me. The Holy Spirit models in an explosively powerful way that a value inbuilt in his church is relevance. That his people will be stretched and they will grow and they will find skills and ways to share the power of God, so that when they encounter somebody new and that person encounters the power of God, they will think they're talking my language. Being relevant isn't an option. It is a mandate. In this particular instance, in his curtain raiser, the Holy Spirit upskills the disciples immediately. They didn't have to do anything except be willing and be available. But there would be later examples of followers of God having to invest more time and energy into the act of being relevant. So later in the book of Acts, we find the Apostle Paul, and he's in Athens. And Athens, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, Athens was the birthplace of the Greek civilization. This is the place which would shape European thought for millennia. And the Apostle Paul has been brought to Athens under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And he starts talking with people of the area. And as you would expect, the people of Athens literally love nothing more than to talk about philosophy and to hear new philosophies and new ideas. But before Paul starts engaging with them, he does his homework. He takes the time to familiarize himself with the city, to get a feel for it, to soak up the culture. He's putting in the work, he's upskilling himself. And then, when he starts telling the Athenians about the God who made heaven and earth, he says to them, this God that I'm talking about, he made all life. And one of your own poets has said, in him we live and move and have our being. Now we need to understand what's happening here. The Apostle Paul, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, in a bid to be relevant, has done homework to learn and to grow. He has come across poetry written by an Athenian poet. This is a non-Christian secular poet. And Paul has thought to himself, this poem has some interesting ideas. And it's representative of the culture that I find myself in. It's like a snapshot. It tells me in some ways what people are thinking about. It shows me things about the culture. So I'm putting this in my memory bank so that I can bring it up as a springboard to talk about God when I speak to some Athenians, so I can speak their language. This is the equivalent of Paul coming to London and going into coffee shops and going to the barbers and going into the gym and intentionally listening to the music that is being played, the music that people are listening to, an indication of how people think and feel, and listening to the music, because poets in Athens were the equivalent of music artists, of like rap stars today. And this is the equivalent of Paul hearing a song on the radio by Drake called God's Plan, a real song, and then Paul starting a conversation with the person next to him in the barbers or the person opposite him in a coffee shop and saying, you see this Drake song, God's Plan, where he's talking about how he thinks his life is unfolding according to God's plan. Do you think that's true? Do you think that there's a case for that for all of our lives? That's literally what Paul is doing. He's intentionally paying attention to the culture, actively looking, actively listening, because this is a part of the work that goes into being a relevant follower of God. And so when Paul goes and speaks to the people of Athens, he's able to be relevant. Now, they don't think that he's an Athenian. They can tell that he isn't one of them. They can tell he's different and he's not like them. But they do see that he's speaking their language. And they listen to him. And some of them say, not for me, I'm not interested. But some of them say, you know what? I'd like to hear more about this. And some of those people become believers. Because Paul saw the essentialness of being relevant. And so he took the time and the energy to make himself relevant. Sometimes the Holy Spirit does all of the hard work to upskill and equip us, like he did with the disciples in giving them the ability to speak new languages in Jerusalem. And sometimes we have to be the ones to do the work and upskill and equip ourselves, like Paul learning poetry in Athens, trusting that the Spirit will then open the right doors for us. But either way, we have to expect the requirement to become relevant in some way. Back in Acts chapter 2, in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit empowered his people to do relevant actions. But that's not all. He came to a relevant place where the people were. And he came at a relevant time, during a festival. Now, this wasn't a place that was particularly relevant to his followers. That's why Jesus had to instruct them, wait in the city, because otherwise they would have gone. The disciples didn't live in Jerusalem, they lived in Galilee. Mary Magdalene, she lived in Magdalena. They didn't live here. The temple, which was the centerpiece of the city, that no longer held any religious significance for them because they got forgiveness from Jesus instead of temple rituals. This place wasn't relevant to them. But this place was relevant to the people that the Holy Spirit wanted them to connect with. The timing was relevant to the people that the Holy Spirit wanted them to connect with. It's like the Spirit was saying to the disciples, saying to his followers, if this place is relevant to this crowd of people, if this festival and this timing is relevant to these crowds of people, then it's relevant to you too. I'll give you the skills, but you need to be prepared to go to places that you might have thought were irrelevant to the mission of the church. And you might have to use these skills at times that you didn't think were relevant to the mission of the church. Like Christmas and Easter and the World Cup and the Olympics and royal weddings. If it's relevant to them, it's relevant to you. That's how they hear you speaking their language. Finally, all of these people from all different walks of life, they encountered the disciples, and each of them heard the gospel in their own language, in a way that they could understand it, in a way that made sense to them. Everyone could clearly see the power of God, that something divine was clearly taking place. But there were some people, having seen this remarkable act, uneducated men speaking in power and boldness in a language that they don't know. There are some people who looked at this amazing thing and they turned their noses up and they sneered. And they said, what are these people on? They're probably drunk or something. This is nonsense. some people looked at the Holy Spirit infilling his followers with the power to be relevant, and they looked down their noses and they sneered because it was different and novel and unlike anything they'd seen before. So they didn't like it. This is an inevitable consequence of being relevant. Some people will be uncomfortable. Some people may see it as being appropriate. They may think that the onus is on other people learning Greek and Aramaic and not on me to learn Arabic and Latin. That's fine. To each their own. But those of us who are striving to be relevant have to remember that the sneerers, they're not a sign that we're doing it wrong. They're a reminder that we're doing it right. Because if people sneered at the disciples of Jesus being empowered by the Holy Spirit to speak about powerful acts of God in languages that they didn't know how to speak, then believe that they are going to sneer at us when we try new things. When we try to pinch shiny little bits from the culture that we see around us, like magpies. When we try to learn new skills and we sing in a choir even though we can't really sing. The sneerers aren't our concern. Our concern is those who have never heard about the powerful act of God spoken in their language. The very first thing that the Holy Spirit does when he makes his grand appearance in Acts is show us that relevance is something that he values. And so because of this, relevance is a value that is chiseled into the spiritual pillar of our church. So I want to give each of us a challenge, a charge. It's not enough to simply form a church culture that is welcoming and grace-filled and inclusive, even though that is super important and it's a huge step in the right direction. But being relevant demands more of us. The Holy Spirit demands more of us. And so I ask you, what new thing are you willing to learn in order to be relevant? Where are you willing to go to be relevant? What are you willing to pinch from the culture to be relevant? How are you willing to adapt and grow and change to be relevant to those who don't yet speak our language? If we are willing, the Spirit has shown that he will equip us and he will make us relevant.